There are lots of mysteries in New York, but this one is even more so. Because it is such a secret from most New Yorkers.
The Highline seen from the street is really a great mystery. I lived down the street and I had no idea what it was living in the neighborhood for 14 years. I just passed by it every day and you only saw a little glimpse of it as it crossed one side of 21st Street to the other and then vanished in between the buildings. So I think a lot of people don't have a full understanding of the beauty of what's on top of it.
Right now, it's a wilderness. It's one of the very few areas of wilderness in New York City, and it's a very poetic kind of wilderness because it's a wilderness in the middle of the air.
I've driven by this neighborhood many, many, many times. I had no idea this was up here. Is that what most people who live in New York think?
Yeah, most people don't know. There's relatively few people who have actually been up here.
Hard to believe that millions of New Yorkers can be all around us and have no idea what's up here.
You just can't believe that you're in New York City. It's only 40 or 50 feet wide, but when you're up there, you're in Vermont, you're in Colorado, you're wherever you want to be. You know you're in New York City, but suddenly the Highline sets up associations, and if you allow yourself, you're somewhere else, and then suddenly you're back in New York City.
This is such a great New York story. It's everything that I love about the vitality of New York. That something wrong is going to happen, a great resource for New York, something that's a part of its history, should be part of its future, is about to be lost. It was almost an inevitability that it was going to be torn down, is now a certainty that it won't be, and that New York is going to have one of the largest new public spaces, in decades. And I love that. I think that kind of activism is completely inspiring. I think it's like the best part of New York's character.
There are what we call these hotspots. These would be some of the entry points and some of the event spaces. So the big steps and the big opening at Gansevoort Market, the possibility of an elevated beach and pool, the possibility of a stage with seating, the possibility of wetland exhibits and garden exhibits. These are what we call the hotspots, the things that people will remember as significant places on the Highline.
I think the Highline, very much like Central Park, will galvanize the whole West Village, Chelsea area that it flows through. I think people will talk about living in the Highline neighborhood. Imagine what Fifth and Madison and Park and Central Park West would be like were there no Central Park.
We want to open the Highline to the public. We want to get people up there. We want to transform it into an elevated park that runs through 3 vibrant and changing Manhattan neighborhoods.
I don't expect to see opportunities like this too many times in my lifetime, if ever again. So it feels like this great opportunity to get involved in something that people will point back at and say, hey, that was a great idea.
Manhattan in the early 1900s, where railroads once ruled city streets. The railroads revolutionized New York City, and ironically, It's the legacy of those old railways that could change Lower Manhattan once again in a big way. Good evening. I'm Jane Hansen. There's a phrase you're going to be hearing a lot more in the future, the Highline. Even if you've never heard of the Highline, if you've spent any time at all in Manhattan over the past 70 years, there's a good chance you've seen it or even driven under it, but you just didn't know what it was. The Highline is an elevated train track that runs south from the rail yards on West 34th Street through Hell's Kitchen, Chelsea, and ending in the meatpacking district on Gansevoort Street. The Highline is almost 7 full acres and hasn't been used since the early 80s. But what's most interesting about the Highline is that an area that big, touching that many neighborhoods of Manhattan, is still virtually a mystery to most New Yorkers. What's even more amazing is that something 22 blocks long, surrounded by millions of people, has virtually been isolated from human contact. Very few people have actually been on the Highline in more than 20 years. But if a group of determined community activists gets its way, that's about to change. In fact, the Highline could transform the West Side below 34th Street. The Highline could be more than just an elevated train track. It could be the most revolutionary public space in New York City since Central Park.
There are lots of mysteries in New York, but this one is even more so because it is such a secret from most New Yorkers.
It's strange, it's surreal. You can feel the rhythm of the street and the city kind of just breathing as you're walking down it. It's as if you're in another world.
It's really like no other place in the city.
I used to look at it and go, you know, what is that? How could anything in New York get left alone for that long?
I noticed this strange curving line that was all grass covered and overgrown. And someone explained to me, oh, that's the Highline.
Well over a mile long, it's an industrial structure that has been overtaken by nature. There are plants, wildflowers, weeds, even trees. It's obvious it hasn't been touched by humans for decades.
When you're up there and you look out, it kind of takes you back in history.
So you get a real sense of New York passing through time from era to era, and it's really magical.
It's a mysterious place that everybody can put to its own imaginative use.
You see a ruin, a modern ruin. It's a very strange and unique perception of New York. You're not distracted by stores, by traffic, by anything.
I've been on it a number of times in different seasons, and I couldn't believe how quiet it was. You know, you would think that just a story and a half above the street, you would think, you'll hear that, you know? But you kind of don't.
It's a place where people can escape, where people can lose themselves. Right now, it's a wilderness. It's one of the very few areas of wilderness in New York City, and it's a very poetic kind of wilderness because it's a wilderness in the middle of the air.
It was just so incredible seeing this wildflower meadow that was growing on the middle of this steel structure on the second floor of a building, you know, above city streets. It's like walking through the clouds of the city, and you get a perspective from river to river that's unlike anything else. It's an amazing place.
Converting the Highline from private property to public space is a mammoth undertaking and a tough one. It probably wouldn't happen without Friends of the Highline, a community group started by two young men who had no real experience navigating through the complicated world of politics and City Hall. But what they've done in a very short time is a lesson that you can do almost anything if you put your mind and your heart into it.
I was concerned that this might become another part of lost New York. So I followed its history, hoping that this wonderful cast iron structure would not just vanish. And then along came two imaginative, courageous, bold young men, Robert Hammond and Joshua David, and decided that not only did they want to keep the Highline, they were actively going to try to do something about it.
I read an article that said they were going to tear it down, and I think this was the summer of 1999. And I thought I'd try to find out a group that was working to preserve it and see if I could help out, see if I could volunteer. And I met another guy, Joshua David, who was sort of doing the same thing, was looking to find out what was happening. And I remember him saying, well, why don't you start a group? I'm really busy and I'll help out. And I said, well, I'm really busy. Why don't you start a group and I'll help out? And we decided we'll start it together.
At that point, we were just two people sitting in our offices at home exchanging some emails, and the structure was on the verge of demolition.
We were really looking for some elected officials to support the project.
I thought that he was nuts, and so I told him to call his local council member and to leave me alone, essentially.
He said, why don't you call Christine Quinn, your local city council person?
When Robert called me, I thought it was a great idea.
And then a few months later, we convinced Gifford to actually go up on a tour, and I think that's where he really fell in love with it.
He finally got me to go up and walk on it, and I fell in love. It's an amazing New York experience.
You know, it takes people like Joshua and Robert to step up and say, we are going to call attention to this issue, and they inspire other people and rally people around them, and that's definitely what's happened here. Within 2 years, something that was almost an inevitability that it was going to be torn down is now a certainty that it won't be, and that New York is going to have one of the largest new public spaces in decades.
A lot of people give us a lot of credit for doing this, but we didn't come up with an original idea. What we did was just sort of raise the flag, and a lot of people have been thinking about this for a long time. It's never been just about preserving the Highline, it's preserving it and reusing, getting people up there, but keeping some of that character that we've all fallen in love with.
There's really nothing else like the Highline in New York City. It's an amazing structure running for 1.5 miles, comprising 7 acres of open space, connecting these 3 incredible neighborhoods. And it just excites your imagination to think, what could we do up there? What could we make the Highline?
Robert Hammond and Joshua David have not only been able to save the Highline from destruction, their efforts have helped convince the city to commit $43 million if they can raise matching funds themselves for the next steps of the Highline's rebirth. So what will the Highline look like if it's converted to public space? How about a 22-block swimming pool? Or how about a roller coaster?
It would rise up really slowly and overlook the Hudson River, and it would come up and curve around, and as it started to go into its straight run, which runs all down through the west side, it would start to pick up speed, and you'd have a moment where you crest at the very top.
Coming up, some innovative and intriguing ideas for the Highline that are much more than just turning it into a park. Even as recently as 3 years ago, it seemed a certainty that the Highline was going to be torn down. Yet architects around the world were infatuated with its mystique and its potential. They hopelessly dreamed of redesigning the Highline, so much so that the Highline was often used as a case study for architects and design students. Now that it appears that the Highline won't be destroyed, a top team of landscapers, designers, and architects has been hired to figure out exactly what the Highline could and will be. Over the years, and in the course of 2 design competitions, the Highline has inspired a variety of ideas, some realistic, others just dreams. But one thing is for sure, the Highline will be like nothing else in America.
We want to open the Highline to the public. We want to get people up there. We want to transform it into an elevated park that runs through 3 vibrant and changing Manhattan neighborhoods.
We have been thinking about giving this a light touch architecturally. Certainly the desire of most architects is to make this thing into another piece of architecture, but our feeling was that it already is. It's a very strong piece of architecture. It's rough and tough and a little bit nasty sometimes, I would say. The challenge is to interpret it, to take this industrial structure and interpret it for a post-industrial time.
There are what we call these hot spots. These would be some of the entry points and some of the event spaces. So the big steps and the big opening at Gansevoort Market, the possibility of an elevated beach and pool, the possibility of a stage with seating, the possibility of wetland exhibits and garden exhibits. These are what we call the hot spots, the things that people will remember as significant places on the Highline.
The pool has a little bit of a history in itself because when the Friends of the Highline put out the original ideas competition, the winning proposal was actually a 1.5 mile long pool.
Those aren't designs that we see building. What we were more interested in is to see how the designers thought about the Highline. So what we wanted them to do was to come up with approaches, see how they were thinking about it.
This idea for the Highline about putting a roller coaster there. Can you describe it for us?
My partner and I, we used to talk about something that would capture the essence of the Highline without allowing people to actually touch the Highline and sort of ruin it by touching it.
So we thought roller coaster would be a fun idea. I mean, you can have fun and still sort of, you know, experience a Highline in a unique way.
It would rise up really slowly and overlook the Hudson River, and it would come up and curve around, and as it started to go into its straight run, which runs all down through the west side, it would start to pick up speed, and you'd have a moment where you crest at the very top, right before it heads down. You would see all of the city just out in front of you. And at that moment, the roller coaster would take off and shoot you all the way down to the bottom, to the meatpacking district.
How high in the sky would it have gone?
I think it didn't quite go as high as the Empire State Building, but it got maybe 20 or 30 stories high.
The roller coaster was 20 or 30 stories high?
In our imaginations, yeah, it was high.
I think the Highline, very much like Central Park, will galvanize the whole West Village, Chelsea area that it flows through. I think people will talk about living in the Highline neighborhood. Imagine what Fifth and Madison and Park and Central Park West would be like were there no Central Park.
It's a fantastically exciting project. We've never really had a kind of challenge like this, and we intend to have a shovel in the ground within a year's time.
Some of the ideas for the Highline, like the roller coaster and the 22-block swimming pool, were never meant to be real options. The goal was to be forward-thinking and innovative, qualities which will be at the core of what ultimately becomes of the Highline. While the design team has been selected, no formal concept for the Highline has been developed. And friends of the Highline still actively encourage neighborhood residents and the general public to be part of the design process. You can find out more by going online at thehighline.org. Coming up, the story of why the Highline was originally built and why it was more than just an elevated train. It was designed to literally save lives. That story coming up. When you look at the Highline today, you might just think of it as an industrial relic stretching for 22 blocks, 30 feet above the ground. But during its heyday, the Highline was called the lifeline for New York. New York City was growing fast in the early 1900s, and the West Side Freight Line claimed to be able to deliver a carload of food to Manhattan every minute, much of which was carried on the Highline. But even more important than its ability to deliver supplies, the Highline was designed to be much more than an elevated train. The Highline was conceived to literally save lives.
As we often forget that New York City, for many years, was the largest manufacturing city in the country. The way it got served was by rail. When the railroad first came through in the 1860s, the city grew around it, traffic grew on them. There were lots of accidents. There were lots of people who were trying to make a ferry, and there was a train coming, so they ran across, and maybe they slipped on the ice or something like that and got killed.
The traffic became so bad that even with a guy on a horse with a red flag leading every locomotive down the street, 10th Avenue became known as Death Avenue.
Eventually, the city grew and grew, and a line in the streets, which is what it was, became intolerable. New York Central's solution below 30th Street was to elevate it. To do this, they bought a lot of property in between blocks rather than putting it over the streets. People were tired of elevated railroads that went over streets by that time. They darkened the streets and so forth. This line sort of sneaked through between the middle of the blocks. If you didn't know it was there, you might just notice a few bridges, and otherwise you might never realize this line was there. To build the Highline was quite a project. The actual cost at the time to the railroad was $110 million. 640 buildings had to be removed to build it, including a church that was rebuilt elsewhere and a couple of schools. There were some buildings they simply went through instead of, they didn't need to destroy them because they were large buildings or buildings they were going to serve.
Bringing it into a building would not have been unusual by any means, but bringing in at the second or third story, that was a little different. The Highline was used to bring freight in, so it was supplying raw materials to factories on the Lower West Side. And a lot of those were food processors, so they were bringing in meat, turkey, milk, and that was being processed and bottled and packaged here in the city.
I worked a couple of summers down there, and I remember dealing with the infamous unloading gangs, the day laborers who were hired to actually take the meat off the Highline boxcars and bring them into the plants. And they actually had their coffee and breakfast down below at Howley's and its predecessor, now known, by the way, as Hogs and Heifers.
They completed 1934. As you all know, this is not the best time to have begun a new line. During the Depression, the traffic was very low. It was followed by World War II. After that, in the 1940s and 50s, the kind of traffic that Manhattan has, either left the city because industry left the city or all went to trucks. I don't think they ever made back even the interest in their investment, much less their investment.
As we see more and more manufacturing going overseas, and as our engineering becomes more and more refined using computer models and things, being able to see, how they constructed something like this and how they got their stuff into the city in those days, I think is an important piece of our history.
Today, more than 20 years after the last train made its last delivery on the Highline, it has basically been untouched. No one is allowed access to the Highline, and it remains a virtual ghost town right in the middle of the busiest city in the world. Coming up, we'll do something very few people get a chance to do: walk on the Highline. As you've seen, the Highline is one of those magical places in New York full of history and intrigue. Even to its neighbors, it still remains a mystery. One reason is that it's extremely difficult to gain access to the Highline. There are no public access points, its gates are monitored, and trespassers are subject to prosecution. But for a lucky few who've been able to walk on the Highline, you'll hear a consistent theme over and over: there is nothing like it. With the permission of the CSX Railroad Corporation, we were granted rare access to the Highline. Not only were we allowed to photograph it, they allowed me to do something few people have had the chance to do: take a walk on the Highline. I've driven by this neighborhood many, many, many times. I had no idea this was up here. Is that what most people who live in New York think?
Yeah, most people don't know. There's relatively few people who have actually been up here. So, even people who, know what I do, right, really, they have no idea what this
is like.
What this is like.
It's amazing to see this place here in the center of Manhattan. You could imagine this being in the Midwest or someplace else where there are essentially abandoned rail lines, but not here.
No, it is unique. And many people, you drive underneath the Highline and, you may or may not know that it was an old freight line. You have no idea of what has taken root here.
It's like nature has taken over.
Nature took over. And it took over with remarkably little to work with. What you see here is all growing in, roughly 2 inches or so of soil. And the growth right now is particularly high. In fact, it's the highest that I've seen it in a few years.
How did this growth end up here? Because nobody planted it.
Train cars made their deposits, birds, and it's what has naturally seeded over the years as no trains have been running.
This particular section, there are even trees here, which are kind of unusual around here, particularly if you described how little there's no soil.
Since we have 2 large buildings right here, it's protected from the wind, so there's particularly high growth.
I just have to look at the pretty wildflowers that are here. I mean, look at these. There's even a cherry tree someplace?
There is. Further south, there is a cherry tree, and on the northern section of the line, there is an apple tree.
Right in this area, we see these wonderful kind of Art Deco sidings.
The Deco railing was put in everywhere that the line went over a public street bed. And then when the line went behind a building like it does right here, you have just the cheaper pipe railing. Right here, it's very quiet.
It's very quiet here, which makes me almost believe I'm not in New York City. I just can't get over the difference between being here and just being a simple 2 stories below on the ground. It's so rare. As I'm looking around here and feeling like I'm in the middle of a prairie, it's hard to believe that millions of New Yorkers can be all around us and have no idea what's up here.
It's true.
It's so funny to see some of the rail lines here, and then they've got all the vegetation that's just growing around it.
It's just taken over.
Yeah, it has.
It really is. Nature just took root and had a party.
So you've seen what it's like above the Highline, but what about under it?
Not only is it built under it, we're part of it. It's sort of built around the columns underneath the Highlines.
Coming up, see how the past and the future come together, and a business that embraces the Highline. There are a lot of grand plans for the Highline. Some are just dreams. Others are real innovative concepts to turn the Highline into 1.5 miles of beautiful and usable public space for New Yorkers. But that's above the Highline. What about the land below it? Today, the property under the Highline is home to a scrapyard, several parking garages, and it's where a lot of those New York corner hot dog carts sleep at night. But there's really only one business today that truly embraces the architecture and legacy of the Highline. The result is a hit for customers and a New York landmark under the Highline.
It's an old structure, but so is the Eiffel Tower.
This gas station facility, it's clearly built underneath the Highline.
Not only is it built under it, we're part of it. It's sort of built around the columns underneath the Highline.
Can you describe for me exactly how you came up with this whole concept?
Well, originally this was a parking lot. We had a space that was very valuable at the time, but we couldn't build up, and something had to be done with this incredible treasure. And so we decided what would be the best business to have that would take in consideration all the traffic.
So you were not in the gas business or any of that stuff before?
No, we originally come from real estate. We were here in January of '96. At a time where the meatpacking was still sort of the Wild West. There's a lot of young artists, a lot of clubs and galleries were opening in the neighborhood, so the seeds were there to make it something really unique.
This is an example where the Highline works intricately with the structure and with the building that we designed.
The original workmanship that went into building this, you can tell that it was very well done.
Oh, without question. Look at everything that's associated with this structure. It's a massive thing. Remember, we had trains running above this thing. Think about the amount of time it took to put this column together. That's art. That is what this is about. Why do we tear this down? This is part of New York.
It's kind of a place to hang out, isn't it?
Yeah.
The Chelsea Car Wash?
Exactly.
Because of the design and the music we play and who we are, we like to boast about it. We sort of end up getting all the high-end cars here. We do a lot of photo shoots here, from American Vogue to major campaigns have been shot in our gas station.
What's it like up there?
It's so beautiful. It's like a pasture. You feel like you're in Connecticut, as long as you don't look too far on either side. The city can use our 200 feet as a model to really figure out what they're going to have to do over the whole lane. sort of become sort of landmark.
So you're a landmark underneath a landmark.
We hope we're a landmark underneath the landmark. We sort of put the High Lines on display a bit. It couldn't be just another gas station car wash, and it had to add to the neighborhood, not take away. And I think that we did a pretty good job.
For years, there's been a lot of people who have wanted to save the High Line from the wrecking ball. But one man set out to do it armed just with a camera. Coming up, the story of how a famous photographer set out to transform the High Line through his pictures.
The High Line is at its absolutely most tranquil after a snowfall. You just can't believe that you're in New York City.
If you'd like to learn more about the Highline, visit Friends of the Highline at thehighline.org.
When everyone was convinced the High Line was destined to be destroyed, one man set out to preserve it for all eternity. Famous photographer Joel Sternfeld was quietly given the magic key and full access to the High Line for 1 year, something no one else had been allowed to do. But Joel didn't want to just take pictures. He wanted to let the world know about a treasure that was about to be lost forever. You are the only photographer that's had access to this.
The only lucky photographer who's had legal access to it. And what that meant is that I could come up here whenever I wanted and simply walk up and down the High Line in every season, in every light, in every weather. And it was heaven. About 2.5 years ago, on a cold March day, I first came up here. You step out onto an old loading dock, and a door opens, and there's the High Line. And it was absolutely magical. It was a real through-the-looking-glass experience. It's like other great first experiences in life. It's terrific. I was up there, and I felt like I was discovering something, a secret world. You know, I think everybody in the city dreams of a secret garden, and I had one. As the only New Yorker allowed to be up on the High Line, I felt I had a responsibility to share the experience with my fellow New Yorkers. And the most honest and simplest way to do that was to simply walk up and down it and always show the path that I was walking. I wanted to walk it in all the different seasons and see the purple heather in early September, the goldenrod in late September, the sumac changing in October, the first snow in December. The High Line is at its absolutely most tranquil after a snowfall. You just can't believe that you're in New York City.
Having this experience of being able to shoot the High Line as you have must be every photographer's dream.
To be the first to look at something and really document it is exhilarating. And here I was in the middle of 14 million people and the first person to really be able to look at it. William Henry Jackson took pictures of Yellowstone. And as soon as he came back to Washington with them, the national park was created. That's what I hoped would happen to the Highline, and now it seems like it is happening, and I don't have the words for it. There's an old expression, even a blind squirrel gets a chestnut every now and then. I got my chestnut with the Highline.
Cold, industrial, rugged. At first glance, the Highline is about as far from a friendly public space as you can imagine. But the Highline has something even more special, heart. It's unique and mysterious, and its magic lures you in. You can see how it could become one of the most innovative and important restorations this city has ever undertaken. I can tell you firsthand that being on the Highline is like nothing else you'll experience in New York. And if all goes well, very soon, you too could take a walk on the Highline. I'm Jane Hanson. I'll see you soon for the next Jane's New York.